I stood in the rain outside our old apartment and said, "Lily, please just talk to me." She crossed her arms and replied, "I'm tired of your small dreams, Ethan. I need more." I whispered, "I'm trying," and she laughed, "Trying isn't enough." Ryan stepped closer behind her and said, "She deserves better," and I snapped, "You don't get to decide that." Lily looked at me and said, "I already did." I held the cheap ring in my hand and said, "This was for you," and she shook her head, "Keep it, I don't want it." I begged, "We built everything together," and she replied, "No, you built excuses." Ryan smiled and said, "Come on, Lily," and she moved toward him. I felt my chest break and said, "So that's it?" Lily stopped and said, "Yes, because you're useless, you were never a real man." Those words cut deeper than any knife. I watched her walk away with him while rain soaked my face and hid my tears. I whispered, "I loved you," but she didn't turn back. I stepped into the empty street and thought, if this is all my life is, I don't want it. I took one more step and heard a horn blaring. I didn't move. I said quietly, "Maybe this will make the pain stop." Bright lights rushed toward me, and in that moment I remembered her smile before it turned cold. The impact threw me into darkness, and my last thought was, this is how my useless life ends. I felt no fear as everything faded, only a strange calm like sleep, and I wondered if anyone would miss me, or if Lily would finally feel something when I was gone, even for a second. I hoped she would remember my name one last. I woke up to the sound of a heart monitor and whispered, "Where am I?" A nurse said, "You're safe, Daniel Carter," and I replied, "That's not my name." She smiled gently and said, "It is now." I tried to sit up and muttered, "This feels like a dream," and she said, "You were in a terrible accident." I closed my eyes and said, "Lily left me," and the nurse answered, "You're not alone anymore." Later Mrs. Carter entered and said, "Daniel, I saved you because I saw something broken but strong in you." I looked at her and asked, "Why me?" She took my hand and said, "Because you needed another chance." I whispered, "I lost everything," and she replied, "Then you have nothing to fear." She told me, "I'm dying and my company has no one left but you." I stared at her and said, "That's impossible," and she said, "I've already signed everything." My heart raced as I said, "You're giving me your life's work?" She nodded and said, "Use it better than I did." I swallowed and whispered, "I don't deserve this," and she smiled, "Neither did I when I started." When she left, I stared into the mirror and said, "So I'm Daniel now." I touched my face and said, "Lily, you made a mistake." I felt something harden inside me as I whispered, "I won't beg ever again." I clenched my fists and said, "I'll make you regret every word." For the first time since that night, I felt power instead of pain, and I knew my old life was gone, but this new one was just beginning. I sat behind my desk as Lily walked into my office and said, "I'm here for the interview." I looked up and asked, "Do you know who I am?" She shook her head and replied, "No, but I heard this company pays well." I said, "Sit down," and she did, rubbing her hands nervously. She whispered, "I really need this job." I leaned back and asked, "Why?" She sighed and said, "Ryan left me and I have nothing now." I nodded and replied, "That sounds familiar." She frowned and asked, "What do you mean?" I said, "Never mind, keep talking." She swallowed and said, "I'll do anything you want if you hire me." I stared at her and said calmly, "You just applied to work for the man you called useless." Her eyes widened and she said, "What?" I stood up and replied, "It's me, Ethan." She stepped back and whispered, "That's not possible." I said, "You didn't think I could survive without you." She shook her head and said, "You were nothing back then." I walked closer and said, "And now I own this place." Her face went pale as she whispered, "So you're the CEO?" I nodded and replied, "Every dollar here is under my control." She grabbed the chair and said, "Please, I didn't mean those things." I looked into her eyes and said, "You meant every word." She started crying and said, "I just need a chance." I crossed my arms and replied, "So did I." For the first time, I saw fear in her instead of pride, and it felt better than any apology she could ever give me, because now she finally understood how much power I had over her broken life. I looked at Lily and said, "You're hired?" And she gasped, "Really?" I nodded and replied, "You'll start today." She smiled nervously and said, "Thank you, I won't disappoint you." I said, "You already did once." She lowered her eyes and whispered, "I know." I walked past her and said, "Follow me." She watched as employees stood up and said, "Good morning, Mr. Carter," and I replied, "Good morning." Lily stared and said, "They really respect you." I answered, they respect results. She followed me into a meeting and said, I didn't know you were this powerful. I smirked and replied, you never wanted to know. Later she leaned close and said, you look different now. I asked, better? And she smiled, more confident. I stepped away and said, this is a workplace. She blushed and whispered, I just wanted to be friendly. I looked at her and said, do your job. Each day she saw people listen to me and she said, everyone trusts you. I replied, because I don't lie. She tried again and said, we used to be good together. I said, we used to be a mistake. She swallowed and said, I miss you. I answered, I don't miss who I was. Inside I felt a cold calm as I watched her realize what she had lost. I wasn't hurting her yet, I was just letting her see me rise while she stayed below, and that was more powerful than anger. This wasn't revenge, it was control, and I enjoyed every second of her silent regret growing inside her heart. I walked into the boardroom as Victor said, we have proof Lily stole company funds. I looked at her and asked, is that true? She shook her head and cried, no, they're lying. Victor pushed papers forward and said, every transfer is here. I said, explain this, and Lily whispered, I was desperate. The board shouted and I said, enough. Lily ran after me into the hallway and said, Ethan, please save me. I turned and replied, Daniel? She froze and said, you still hate me. I answered, I only hate lies. She sobbed and said, Ryan left me and I had nothing. I said, so you stole. She cried, I was scared. I leaned closer and said, you were greedy. She grabbed my sleeve and said, we loved each other once. I pulled away and replied, you loved what I gave you. She fell to her knees and said, I didn't know you'd become this. I said, you never cared to see. The board called me back and I said, handle it by the rules. Lily screamed, you're ruining my life. I looked at her and said, you ruined it yourself. She whispered, I thought you were useless. I replied, I was just blind to you. As security took her away, I felt no joy, only a quiet truth settle in my chest, because she finally understood that I was never nothing, and she had been the one who threw everything away when she chose greed over love. I stood in my office as Lily dropped to her knees and said, I loved you, I was stupid. I looked down and replied, stand up. She shook her head and cried, Ryan won't answer me, I lost everything. I said, that happens when you build on lies. She grabbed my leg and said, please, I'll do anything. I said, you already did. She whispered, I chose him over you. I answered, you chose money over love. She said, I was scared of being poor. I replied, so you made me feel small. She sobbed, I didn't know you'd become this powerful. I said, you never wanted to know me. She lifted her face and said, I miss us. I replied, I miss who I was before you broke me. She said, I can fix this. I answered, you can't fix what you sold. She cried, I need you. I said, you need what I have. She whispered, I was wrong about you. I replied, you were blind. She tried to stand and said, give me one chance. I said, I gave you all of them. She looked at me and said, do you hate me? I answered, I don't feel anything. She said, that's worse. I nodded and replied, you didn't love me, you loved what I could give. I turned away as she stayed on the floor, and for the first time I felt truly above her, not in anger but in quiet truth, because the power had finally shifted into my hands. I stood by the window as Maya said, are you okay? I nodded and replied, I finally am. She smiled and said, you don't have to look back. I turned and said, I'm done living in my past. Lily's name flashed on my phone and I said, I won't answer. Maya asked, do you want me to block her? I shook my head and said, no, I'll end this myself. I typed a message and whispered, you called me useless, now I own the life you destroyed. I hit send and felt my chest loosen. Maya looked at me and said, that took courage. I replied, it took pain first. She said, you don't owe her anything. I answered, I owed myself. We walked out of the office together and Maya said, what will you do now? I smiled and said, build something real. She laughed softly and said, I believe in you. I replied, I finally believe in me. My phone buzzed again and I didn't check it. Maya touched my arm and said, you look lighter. I said, I dropped something heavy. She asked, what was it? I replied, her control over my heart. We stepped into the sunlight and I said, I didn't win her back. Maya finished, You won yourself. I nodded and said, that's the only victory that matters. For the first time since everything fell apart, I felt free, not because she was gone, but because I finally chose myself over every lie that once made me feel small, and that freedom felt better than any revenge ever could.